Hello, photography students. This is Mrs. Danner, and today we're going to go through the Photos program on your laptop and learn how to edit photos in that program. We are also going to use Photoshop later on, but some of you still don't have Photoshop, and we're not quite ready to tackle Photoshop yet. Photos is kind of like an easier version of Photoshop. So if we get a handle on photos first, then we'll be able to use Photoshop a little bit more effectively. Plus, you'll only have Photoshop this semester while you're in a class that requires it. So next semester, when you're editing photos, it's important that you know how to use the program Photos because that will be on your laptop. So you can use that even after you don't have Photoshop anymore. So you took 10 pairs of pictures when you did your rule of thirds assignment, and you should have those saved on your computer or in your phone. You'll need to get those into the photo program by dragging them into Photos from your desktop. But you'll get those into your photos, and when you do that, you're going to have a bunch of photos on the left-hand side of your picture. So you'll have, I have 3 because I just have the 3, but you'll have much more because you should have 20 total. And we're going to use those today to practice editing, and you'll turn those in after you've done some specific things editing-wise to those photographs. So I have a picture here of a chair, and I'm going to use this to go through the program Photos so you can see how you edit in this program. The first thing you need to know about Photos is that it always keeps an original. So even after you've edited it and saved it and you've had it for years, you can click Revert to Original, and it's going to go back to that original photo. Also, anytime you make an adjustment to a photo in Photos, anywhere you save that, so if you have it on the desktop or you have it in an album, if you make that change on one photo in the editing program, it is going to change all of the photos. So if you want to edit, maybe you want to crop a photo one way for one project, and you save it one way, and then you want to crop the same photo in a different way for another project, you need to make sure you make a duplicate. So in order to make a duplicate, you'll highlight one of your photos up here. So you can pick a photo, and then you're going to go to Image, and then Duplicate one photo. And if you click that, it's going to come up with another photo in your library. And then that way you can edit one without worrying about that edit going to the same photo that you have saved in other places. So that's probably the first thing you're going to want to do when you're editing a photo in the program Photos. We're going to go ahead and start to edit, and I'm going to start with this photo. And when you're ready to edit, there is an edit button in the upper right hand corner. So you'll click edit, and then that will take you to the editing screen. So the editing screen is different because it is black. So you'll notice that it looks different. It's also going to have some tools on the side that we're going to go through and talk about. On the left-hand side, upper left-hand side, it has a box where you can store that library, so you don't need that anymore. You can click that and make it go away. You can also make it bigger and smaller using this drag bar, or you can use your fingers on the mouse pad like you do when you're looking at a photo on your phone. So you can slide it up or open and closed to make that zoom go in. So we're going to start with crop, and we've talked about crop a little bit already, but there's a couple different things you can do in this crop editing part of Photos. First of all, like I said, when we edited these photos originally, there's an aspect button down here, and when you click on that, right, it's set for freeform, which means you can move this however you want. So you can click it and you can make it long and skinny like that, or you can try to get it to a natural looking photograph. But if you want to print your picture, you're going to want to make sure that it is one of these standard sizes. So 8 by 10, 5 by 7, either one of those is fine. You'll want to click on one of these ratios to keep your photograph in a printable size. So I normally pick 5 by 7, but you can pick any one of these, and that's going to keep it in proportion when you're ready to print. You also have the option to turn your composition either horizontally or vertical. So those are options for you. And then another option when you are in the cropping section of the editing tool is to rotate. So you'll notice when I click and drag here on this wheel, it rotates your picture, and it's going to tell you what degrees it rotates to. But if you want to rotate something so it looks straighter on your photograph, you can do that. It also provides these lines, which is nice because if you're, let's say you want your table leg to be straight up and down, so I can move this until that table leg meets up with one of those lines. So I can move this over, and then I can rotate this until it would be about straight. So if you're looking to try to make a tree straight or something in your photograph, you can rotate this with your lines, and that's going to help you out. Another option is to flip your photograph, so it only has an option to flip it side to side. So these are some options for you as you are cropping your photograph. And then if you click reset at any time, it's going to go back to that original photograph. So for now, I'm going to go ahead and click 5x7, and I'm going to crop this just a little bit. And you'll notice too that you move the picture, you don't move the crop. So you get your crop ready, and then you're going to move your picture around. And I can still use the zoom in and zoom out feature with my fingers that I was using before. So I can zoom in and I can move this over a little bit. So I'm just using the keypad right now, the touchpad, to crop this photo. So I don't even really have to use this at all unless I want to. But I can move this along using just the keypad. So I've got a crop that I like. So I'm going to go ahead, and after you've got the crop that you want, you're going to click this crop button again. And that's going to save it as the crop that you just selected. So once you've cropped your photograph, another thing I'm going to talk about is the Enhance tool. But in order to understand the Enhance tool, you need to know what the Adjustment tool does. And when you open this up, yours probably looks like this. So it doesn't have the other options. It just says light, color, black, and white. But if there's an arrow on the right-hand side, if you click the down arrow, then it's going to give you a lot of options. So exposure, highlights, shadows, brightness, and contrast, and black point. If you have this open and then you click the Enhance button. So the Enhance button is kind of like the magic wand. It's like a magic wand. So it'll change your photograph and it will adjust these features the way it thinks that it would look better. So if I click this, you're going to notice right now all of my adjustments are lined up in a straight line. I'm going to click the Enhance button and now see how this has changed. So now instead of being in a line, my computer automatically changed these to make the photo have a little more contrast. So it lowered the highlights and the exposure, and then it upped the shadows. So what that did is it made the dark spots darker, the brightness, the contrast. So it upped a few things and then lowered a few things. So if you click that magic wand, that Enhance, it's going to change these adjustments. Now, we don't really want to do that right now, so I'm going to go ahead and click Reset Adjustments, which is down here, because I want you to play with these on your own to see what you think looks better. But this is a good option for you if you're editing your own photos and you just feel like it needs a little extra oomph. So you can click that Enhance, and it's going to adjust these for you automatically. So if we go back to the adjustments, so we're still in the Adjustments tab. So we're still in the Adjustment tab, and you see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 options here, and this is going to change your photograph from the way it looks originally. So the first one is exposure, and exposure is how much light gets into your photograph. So when we were in the camera obscura, the amount of light that came in through that teeny tiny pinhole, it's the same thing with a camera. So if you have the ability to adjust your exposure on a camera, then that means you're going to let more light in. And what it does in a digital editing tool is it just makes more light. So when I slide the exposure up, then it makes the light in my photograph more visible, so it lightens my photograph. If I drag it down, it's going to make it darker. So it's just letting light into my photograph. And if it's right in the middle, then this is what my camera selected for me when I took that picture. Because you have a digital automatic camera, the exposure is set for you in your camera already. So it takes kind of a middle range exposure, but there may be some instances where you want less light, like maybe if you're outside and it's really bright and you want to darken that photograph, so you can change the exposure here, or maybe you're in a dark area when you take a photograph and you need to let some of that light in, so you can change that light here in the exposure. One thing I want to talk about real quick, let's say I have all of this exposure. So this is obviously not great exposure because it's washing some of my areas out. So we want to find a spot where my lights are light, my darks are dark, and I'm not washing out any of my photograph. But I want to show you this as an example. I have a lot of exposure here, and then I want to see the original. So maybe I'm making some changes and I'm editing this, and I've kind of forgotten what the original looks like. You can actually press and hold down your M key on your keyboard, and it's going to go back to the original. So if I hold it down, this is my original photo, And you can see that I don't have as much light as I do with the exposure. And when I let go of that M key, I have all that exposure. So I have all that light. So you can see the difference here. Okay, so at any time when you're editing, you can click and hold that M key, and it's going to show you the original photograph, so you can compare that. I'm going to move this exposure back to the middle, or I can just click Reset Adjustments, and I'm going to talk about highlights. So your exposure is how much light is getting into your photograph, and your highlights are the light parts of your photograph. So if you look at my photograph, my light parts are kind of on the chair legs, where like the light's hitting the legs. When I talk about highlight, I'm just talking about making those highlights lighter or darker based on which way I move my highlights. So if I click here and I drag up, you're going to see that those light spots are getting lighter. If I drag down, you're going to notice that the light spots are getting darker. Now, this does affect the whole photo. So when we're in Photoshop, we can talk about how to just make the highlights lighter or darker. But because you are editing this photo as a whole, you can't pinpoint what you want to do. The whole thing is getting lighter and darker. So it's just the light areas you're going to notice are getting lighter and darker when I move this highlight around. The darker spots are pretty much staying the same. So here I am with a lot of highlights, a lot of lowlights, and I'm going to click Reset Adjustments. So like I said, the highlights are the ones, the lighter spots, that are getting adjusted when I use the highlights bar, but I can't just specify one highlight. So when I do the shadows, it's the opposite. It's going to be the dark areas. So I'm making the dark areas lighter, or the dark areas darker. So you can see how much darker that gets when I take those dark areas. We're just making our darker spots lighter or darker depending on which way you drag that bar. So I'm going to go ahead and click Reset Adjustments. That's going to go back to the original. And then I'm going to talk about brightness. So brightness is brightening up the entire photo. So not only adding light areas, but making even the darker areas brighter. So it is similar to exposure in that it's letting light in, but you can see that exposure does not brighten the entire photograph. So I'm on exposure right now. It's just letting light into where the light is already in my photograph. So I'm going to reset that. When I do the brightness, I am making the entire photograph brighter. So my brightness is not really paying attention to what's dark and what's light. It's just putting sort of a cover over all of it and brightening the whole thing. Or maybe it's darkening the whole thing based on which way I slide that. So you can make it darker or brighter depending on what you are looking for. And something that kind of goes with brightness is contrast. So you'll often hear brightness and contrast, because if I move my brightness all the way up, it's going to make everything lighter. And then I can improve that by upping my contrast. So as I up my contrast, my darker spots are coming back in. So when I just have my brightness, I'm brightening that whole photograph. So even my dark spots are getting light. But when I add my contrast in there with my brightness, those dark spots are going to come back. So I can lighten up that photograph and darken my dark areas with my contrast. And that's going to help keep the photo in proportion to each other, so I don't have a light spot or a dark spot. So contrast is going to play with the dark and lights of your photograph. I'm going to take the dark spots and make them darker, and it's going to take the light spots and make them lighter. So contrast is the way two things look based off of each other, and often darks and lights. So you'll notice that the more contrast I have, the darker those dark areas get, because then in turn those light areas get lighter. So I'm going to reset those adjustments. And then the last one is black point, and this has to do with the darkest dark in your photograph. So it's taking the darkest darks and it's darkening them. So just like it says black point, it's taking those black points, making it dark. So you can see, kind of looks like a horror movie getting darker. So you can see how those darker areas under the table especially, you can see how they, so they have these dark areas here. And as I pull this black point, those darker areas get darker and darker and darker and darker. So it's just making those darker areas darker. So let's say you have a photograph that's overexposed, so it has too much light, and you play with the contrast, but the dark areas are getting a little bit too light. So you can move this to make that dark area a little bit darker, and that's going to help with your contrast. So it's only dealing with the darkest dark, whereas contrast deals with all of the darks in your photograph. But the black point's only going to be those dark areas. So that's the editing tools for light. So I'm going to close those. And then I'm going to talk about color. Saturation is the first of the bars that you can play with as far as color, and saturation is how much color is in your photograph. So as I move it to the left, it's taking color out of my photograph, and if I go all the way to the left, you'll notice it's black and gray. If I go to the right, it's adding more color, so it's making my colors richer, and you're going to notice that the floor kind of turns a green color because it has a green tint, so it's adding more of that green in there. My table turns yellower, my chairs are redder, so it's changing those colors and making them more saturated. It has more pigment in the photograph. I'm going to reset those, and then the next one is contrast, and this is the same that you had in light, only this contrast has to do with color. So whereas the contrast in your light section edited the light and dark in your photograph, the contrast in this section is going to play with the color. So it's going to look at, and you can see, if you watch the table, you can see it change a little bit. It's going to make the colors that are next to each other more different so that they contrast a little bit more. So you can see the wood grains pop out here, and then as I move it the other way, it gets lighter. So that contrast is changing when I move that around. The last one is cast, and you can think of that as like an overall filter. Cast is going to change the colors. It's going to, basically what it says, it's going to cast a color on to your photograph. So you can see as I move it to the left, it's getting kind of a green tint, or to the right, it has a yellow tint. So it's just going to take some of those colors in your photograph, and it's going to cast a shadow over your photograph like a filter and make the colors more unified. So you can play with that to see the colors change in your photograph. So I'm going to reset those. So that's the color portion of your editing tools. And then if I click on my black and white, I have intensity. So if I change it to black and white, so now it's black and white instead of color, the intensity is how dark your darks are and how light your lights are. So you can see in the chair especially, you can see these things moving. As I go up in the intensity, I'm having more hard lines. My darkers are getting darker. As I go to the left, my lines are getting a little softer. I don't have as much value. Readjust. My neutrals for black and white, you're looking at the medium values when you do your neutrals, and you'll notice if you look at the floor on the upper, in this area right here, you'll notice as I move this, my neutrals are changing a little bit. So all of those medium in between values are going to change when I mess with my neutrals, and as I go further to the left, you can see that these neutrals really stand out. You see those lights and the mediums and the darks, but when I go to the other direction, those get washed out. So it's taking those in between values and it's making them more alike. Tone is again playing with the light, and as I go to the right, I'm going to notice that it gets darker, and the left, it's going to get a little bit lighter. And as I adjust this, I can look at the lights, the lighter areas in this picture. It's going to change the way that some of these look based on where I move that bar. The last one is grain, and that's sort of the smoothness of the picture. So we can't really, if you look at this table right here, as I move the grain, you're going to notice that these get grainy, basically. So you're going to see how this gets a little bit messier. So the grain is sort of the cleanness of the photograph, and the more grain you have, the more it's going to look like an old photograph. So you can change those adjustments. However, I don't think that this will be a tool that you use that often unless you want something to look like it's old. So those are the adjustments that are on your adjustment bar, and we just went through all of those. You do have the option to add extra adjustments to your adjustment bar, and so you could pick white balance levels. Vignette is one that you are probably familiar with. It's the one that adds like a circle around your picture, so you can see it gets darker in here. So you can play around with some of these. If you add them, you can unclick them. Sharpen would be a good one to look into. So this sharpens your picture. Levels. So you can play around with some of these as well. But once you're done with your adjustments, then you will click the adjustment button back here, and that's going to close the adjustment tab for you. And then you can continue to edit your photo. Another option for you is the filter button. So if I click filters, you'll go through and you can see there are a bunch of filters already created for you. This is just like Instagram. You can add these filters to your photos. If you decide to do that, then you'll just hit that filters button and then you've got your options again. But I'm going to go ahead and go back to my filters and I am going to click none so we can continue to talk about some other options for you. Retouch is another option in photos. And if you click retouch, you're going to have a size thing right here. And as you go up, this is going to make your paintbrush bigger. So this is the size of your paintbrush. So you can pick kind of a middle one. So I can actually use this to erase an object in my photo. So let's say I want to get rid of this shadow down here. I can just click and drag this shadow that I want to get rid of and cover it all up. And then when I let go, it's going to, see how it softens that shadow a little bit, so it gets rid of this line. So anything that you drag over, it's going to just sort of blend into the background and get rid of some of those sharp edges. So I can do that with the shadow, or if you have a spot in your picture that you want to get rid of. I went over the table or the chair leg here, but you can even see if I go over this chair leg, it's going to blend it into what's behind it. So it's not always super accurate because right here I have it overlapping a table. When we get into Photoshop, we can be more specific about what we take out. But you can see that it's just taking the background and blending it in with what I selected. So I'm going to reset this. And then another option is to actually find a spot in your photo that you want to recreate, or maybe you have, like if I zoom in here, I have this spot on my chair. Let's say I want to get rid of this spot. I can actually take this color from my chair and use it to fill in another spot. And you're going to do that the same way, except for instead of just clicking and dragging, you're going to click your option button. And when you do that, you're going to get this little guy, and you'll click where you want to take the color from. And then you'll let go of your option, and you're going to highlight what you want to change into that color. So you can see that this cursor that I clicked on to begin with when I hit the option button followed me around, and now see how that's gone. So I can click option again. I can select the color that I want to use, which is this color right here. I let go of option, and then when I start erasing my areas, that option button, that cursor that I clicked, is just tracing the area that I'm going to put in the part that I'm erasing right now. So it's taking the color that it was picking up from the first spot and covering it with that same color. So you can see when I zoom back, I have a chair that looks cleaner than before. So I'm going to do that over here so you can see it a little bit better. If I click option over here and I select that and then I go over this, it's going to copy what it's following right now, that cursor is following, and it's going to put that in my picture. So see how that duplicated that spot where my cursor was. So you can see a little bit better how it really sort of takes anything that you drag with that option button and transfers it to the new spot. So this would be used when like covering blemishes. You would click option on somebody's face and then you would cover up their blemish. That way you use the same skin tone that's already there. It's used quite often for retouch. I'm going to go ahead and click reset. So those are really your only options for retouching. When we get into Photoshop, you're going to be able to learn how to retouch more specific spots of your photo and some other cool things you can do to manipulate your photograph a little bit more. There is also an option down here, more, and this may look familiar to you if you use photos on your phone. If you click that, we don't have it installed on our computers. I don't think you have it on yours either, but if you ever wanted to write on a photograph, when you do that, yep, it's not going to come up. If you click the more button on your phone, then it's going to give you a markup toolbox looking thing, and you can click on that and it'll let you type on, and draw on your photo. So that's another option for you outside of school. I don't think you have these extensions available on your computer since I don't have them on my computer, but on your phone you might be able to use that as well. Okay, so those are some just tools and tricks that you can use in photos. You are now going to go to your stream in Google Classroom and complete your assignment using the 20 photos that you took when you did the rule of thirds assignment. Okay, good luck. Bye.